community is more important than the individual.
Yeah.
There's a Chinese proverb that goes, we come together and we build the boat together. And when the tide comes in, we all sail away together. And that is what kept the Chinese families able to cope with the head tax and the Exclusion Act, was the family, the sense of family and community. And it's interesting to note, Chinatowns were created not by the Chinese, but by the white population, because the Chinese were not allowed to live in areas where the white people lived. They were given the land which nobody wanted. For example, you take in Calgary, right? Calgary's Chinatown was moved 3 times. Mm-hmm. And the last one is here down by the Bow River. And why were they allowed to come down by the Bow River? Because this is where the Bow River flooded every year, right? It was land nobody wanted. But the Chinese came here, and then at that time, when the Chinese in Calgary wanted to, for the 3rd time, settle by the Bow River, there was a city alderman named James Short that brought up a petition and said the Chinese should not be allowed within the city limits at all. And it was a few other citizens that actually objected and said they have the right to be there. So this is this idea of the Exclusion Act goes deeper than what Canadians really admit to, that there is this resentment, this economic resentment against other races. But it's interesting to note that the Chinese are the ones that were singled out more than any other group. And you don't find that there was discrimination against the Ukrainians and the Poles and the German immigrants, and but it was only the Chinese that were documented to this extent. And if you want to know, there's what's her name, Catherine Claymont created that exhibition called Following the Paper Trail. Mm-hmm. That's currently in the Chinese Museum. She was doing a documentary on Canadian-Chinese war veterans, and because they're not recognized, and that fought in World War II. And she found a number of these old veterans, and she convinced them, can you tell me your story about what you did in the war? And so she started talking, and they started to relate to her about what they did in World War II. They don't really like talking about it, but they were proud to serve their country. And so she asked them, do you have any memorabilia or whatever, things like that? And she noticed in some of the memorabilia they had in a box, there was this CI 45 certificate. She didn't know what they were. And they asked them, well, what's this CI 45 certificate? And here's a person that's an archivist, a professional researcher, and they told her, well, this is where we had to register as to remain in the country. And from that, she went back and she looked at the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it wasn't for her, we wouldn't have this, a lot of the information we have. And so she had a 2-year project. And she says, how can I contact as many Chinese people as possible? And so she just sent out feelers to different people in the Chinese community and said, do you know anybody that has these CI 45 certificates? And I was contacted by her. And in an email, and then actually I talked to her, and she explained to me the whole thing about the CI 45 certificate. And she says, would you happen to have one of these? And I says, yeah, I do. I didn't know what it was. It's in my photo album. And it's a CI 45 certificate of my father. And she says, could I get a copy of this? And there was a person in Calgary that had a good laser printer, and she made a good facsimile, sent it to her, and she said, could you also write a story about your father, about his life story? And within her 2-year project, she was able to collect over 400 head tax certificates and CI 45 and 44 certificates with stories, and she created that exhibition that is in the Chinese Museum in Vancouver.
Wow.
And and then we find out the government has allowed the releasing of those the documents. They're on microfiche, and if you have you can go to the Chinese Museum, and if you have the certificate number, you can actually start looking up your ancestors.
Wow. I did not know that.
Yeah, and you can do that too. Like if you think you have relatives, and then you can actually go and find their certificates. Everything the United States did, Canada followed shortly after. And here, look at that poster. It says, "Hip hurrah! Chinese excluded from your democratic president." Right? And the same thing happened in Canada. There were big posters when the Exclusion Act was implemented. Right? There was a celebration in the mainstream community. Right? And okay, just go forward. Yeah. So talking about my grandfather, when he comes, right? He had to pay the $500 head tax, and he left Canton in about 1900. He went back to his village in Toisan province or Taishan province, and he has a little tailor shop and cleaning shop in the village. The railroad workers, they went back to their village, and they still had enough money to buy a piece of land and purchase a wife, right? And that's the way it was, right? So you're 40 years old, you get a 16-year-old wife, you get her pregnant, and life couldn't be better. You got a farm, you got a wife, you got some kids, and what do? You go down to the and talk about the old days at my grandfather's little tailor shop, and they're sitting there drinking tea, and that some of them said, "Oh, why don't you go to Canada, to the Golden Mountain? You can make money like us and come back rich." Of course, they embellish it, right? Like, don't tell you like they just died over there, but they came back. And my grandfather says, "Well, what chance have I to go there? I don't have." And this is, "We'll sponsor you. We'll give you," and that's the Benevolent Association, right?
Yeah.
We will get you the passage over there. We can get you the head tax, and we can get you a job. And when you're successful, you will help the next person. That's the idea of the family and the community. And so they did. And so we can go to the next slide. And so there's a typical rural village. That's the one in Hoi Ping. And there's a benevolent association, right? And in every Chinese village, they would have their own association, right? You would have your Lee Association, your Wong Association. And when the Chinese came to Canada, those same associations existed. So that was the continuity of from China to Canada. Okay, so here's a picture of a blue funnel steamer that my grandfather came over, and it was stamped on his head tax certificate. He came over on the Mexico Maru, that blue funnel steamer, and here's a copy over there in 1912 of the ship's manifest, right? And it lists, the different cargo that's in there, right? And including the Chinese documentation. And it's interesting to note that when the Chinese were put aboard the boat, right? My grandfather, they got him a job. They stuck him down in the hold in the ship, and he stayed there for 6 weeks shoveling coal next to the engine. And can you imagine being down where the pistons and the oil and anyways, that's where he was. And then when he came to Vancouver, right, you had to pay immediately the $500 head tax to the captain of the ship, and he collected it for the government. And if you didn't get off the ship, and you were sent back.
Wow.
Okay, so we go to the next. So my grandfather works as a stevedore coming over.
Just curious, what's a stevedore?
Shoveling coal.
I see.
Right. All right. So when my grandfather comes to Vancouver, he's given a job working on the CPR, and his job is to grease the bearings of the engine, and also the bearings on every wheel in the steam engine. And so at every whistle stop, he would have to get out where they stop for water, right? And he'd have to grease all the bearings. And he remembers, he says that they started in Vancouver, and the train went through the BC interior. Then it came into Alberta and went up to Edmonton, Calgary, Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, and then it turned around and came back. And he remembers coming to Lethbridge and coming to the train station, and there was nothing there. There was literally nothing, it was just, and he said to himself, when I get finished working on the railroad, I think I'll come here and open a business because there's no Chinese people here and there's no competition. And that's an interesting thing to note, because what the Chinese did when after the completion of the railroad in was it 1885, around there, right? What happened is all the Chinese workers were just simply laid off. You're gone. And the ones that didn't have any money to get back to China, you were forced to find jobs anywhere across Canada. And so that's why you find across the prairies, in all these little towns, you would find a little Chinese restaurant. And the rule was, if you came to a small town and you were the first Chinese family there, you opened up your business there. And that was your little town. And if another Chinese family happened to come by and they saw you were there, they would go to another town because they didn't want to compete.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we'll go to it. So here's the head tax certificate of my grandfather and my grandmother, right? Of Lee Duck and Lee Sun Yet. There's a picture of my grandfather and my grandmother, and with their first two children. Okay, and the little man in the stroller is my dad, and he actually passed away when he was 95.
Wow.
And on the side in the lettering there, in Chinese, he refers to my grandfather. My grandfather's bachelor name was Lee Duck, but when you got married, you would have a Chinese name, and it was Li Hung Loi. And he's presenting this picture to the Sun family as for allowing him to marry my grandmother, and she was her name was Sun, but you have to remember she was bought and sold twice as a servant girl before my grandfather was able to purchase her for his second wife, right? So, but you tell these stories to mainstreams and they're shocked, right? Mm-hmm. But they have no cultural sensitivity of what was going on, right? There's a picture on the left, and I found this out differently. I got this from my cousin, and on the top photograph is actually my grandmother's family in China, and her family was their last name was Der, and they fell on hard times, so they sold their daughter to the Sun family as a servant girl, right? Mm-hmm. And then you see the bottom photograph. That is the Sun family. That's one of the Sun families. And I actually met the boy on the left, and he was like 90 years old at the time.
Wow.
And he was the one that told me that my grandmother was their servant girl, and she was looking after him when my grandfather appeared, and he had asked the Master Sun, would you be willing to part with your servant girl? And he says, yeah, if you pay her boat passage and her head tax, and we can work out a deal. So, but over on the other side, there is my grandmother's CI 44 certificate for the Exclusion Act, where she was registered. And this was interesting, as I was only contacted a couple of weeks ago by Gerald Sun, and he went to the Chinese Museum and he was looking up his relatives' CI 45 and 44 certificates, and he found this one, and he says, am I related to you? Because he saw the name Lee Duck, right? And I wrote back and I says, and I talked to him, yes. But you notice here, she was registered by the Sun family, and for her to stay here. And what did my grandfather do? Okay, after he left, he came back to Lethbridge and he started Lee Duck Dry Cleaners, and he had several different shops where they moved, right? And you can see him there in the early days with. He started that business for 65 years, and all the children, grandchildren worked in that business. I even worked there.
Oh, really?
I worked there and, when I was, actually I started when I was 8 years old, doing little thing, putting things on hangers and all that. And then when I was, 16, 17, I would be pressing pants and until I found a construction job. But it was open for 65 years,
Wow.
and it was all run by different family members, right? So my father, who was born here, was not allowed to be a citizen.
Wow.
And that's part of the Exclusion Act, right?
Yes.
And there's my father's CI-45 certificate.
Oh.
Look at, there he is. He's about 9 years old. Right at the bottom, in very fine print, this certificate does not give
Legal status.
give any Canadian citizenship rights. But that's basically so they could keep track of you, and you had to produce it. Slide here. Oh yeah, there's the notice, more in detail, you can see it. And this is what I went back to my grandfather's ancestral village, and I found the house that he built. And he built a bridge across the river there. And that bridge has been since rebuilt. But there they still call it Mr. Lee's Bridge, and they have the history of it. And my grandfather, with all his businesses here, with the dry cleaners, he took his money and he invested it back in China. And he built, he had apartment buildings and land. And I asked him, why did he do that? He says, well, you're not allowed to be a citizen here. So you could be kicked out at any time. So he chose to invest money there, and he was very, very wealthy there. And that's why he was bringing his children back. And he had more than one wife too, right? And he set the wives up in businesses. And unfortunately, he chose the wrong side. And he came back to Canada. And to this day, the Chinese government will allow us, if we show ownership, we can go back and reclaim that house. But most of we don't want to go back there because you just have to spend money. But that house is built. It's over 100 years old, and my grandfather learned how to make cement and all that. And he went back and he showed the villagers how to build that house. It took them a year to build this house. When I think of our relatives and the head tax and I think of all the ancestors, all the people that gave up so much to come to Canada, and it was all about getting a better life for their family. And all the railroad workers were the same. My grandfather was just another progression of what the railroad workers, why the railroad workers came, looking for a better life for their families. And
Yeah, so I'm just actually kind of curious, your grandfather, built a business, your father and you as well, being involved. How did your family kind of overcome the different challenges presented by the act?
well, what you do is you work hard, you become members of the community, but and we would have family gatherings all the time, right? We would always have family dinners, right? You'd extend that, we'd all come together, and our activities, our holidays would be spent together. The businesses, for example, the Lee Duck Cleaners, my grandfather set it up so the three brothers were partners in the business, and then and we all worked at the business, and so you all share in the business, and you all share in the wealth. And